When I was a kid, my grandfather was like a ghost in my life, more legend than man. He lived miles from the nearest town, tucked away in a moss-covered cabin near a forest so thick the trees looked like jagged teeth against the sky. No electricity, no running water. Just him, a wood-burning stove, and a shotgun he kept leaned against the wall by the door. He liked his solitude, he'd say, but even as a child, I sensed there was something he wasn't telling us. Something haunted about his eyes when he talked about the forest. The thing about Grandpa's cabin was that the nights weren't quiet. Most people imagine a place that remote would be peaceful, maybe even serene. But out there, under the dense canopy of those gnarled trees, the dark was alive. Every night, like clockwork, the sounds would start. Sometimes it was distant howls that didn't quite sound like wolves. Other times it was whispers, so faint and fleeting you'd think your ears were playing tricks on you. And then there were the screams. That was the thing Grandpa never liked to talk about. The screams. Sharp, wet, and full of terror. They came from deep within the forest, always at the same time, just after midnight. If you ever brought them up, he'd go quiet, his weathered face drawn tight. "Don't ask about things that don't concern you," he'd say, his voice low and firm. And that was the end of it. But the sounds were part of his life. He said he'd gotten used to them, learned to live with the unease. "The forest has its rules," he told me once, leaning back in his creaky wooden chair. "You don't go looking for trouble, and it won't come looking for you." For years, he stuck to that rule. But rules have a way of breaking down when you're alone for too long. One fall, something changed. Grandpa had been looking rough, thinner than usual, dark circles under his eyes. When I visited him with my dad to bring supplies, he barely said 2 words the entire time we were there. That wasn't like him. Usually, he'd tell us about the wildlife he'd seen or complain about the government. But that day, he just stared at the forest, his jaw tight and his hands trembling. I remember asking him if he was okay, and he muttered something under his breath. I only caught a few words, but they stayed with me. "They're closer now. Too close." Dad brushed it off, said Grandpa was just getting old. But a week later, the sheriff found a note nailed to the door of the cabin. Grandpa was gone. The note was short, barely a sentence. All it said was, "I have to know." We didn't see or hear from Grandpa for months after that note. The sheriff organized a search, but they didn't find much. Just his tracks heading into the forest. Then nothing. Like he'd been swallowed whole. Dad tried to tell himself Grandpa had probably wandered off and died of exposure, maybe a heart attack or a fall. But I could tell he didn't really believe it. Nobody did. The forest doesn't give up its secrets easily. I wasn't supposed to, but I went out to the cabin one weekend. I think I just wanted to feel close to Grandpa, maybe convince myself he'd come back. I still had the spare key, and when I stepped inside, the first thing I noticed was the silence. The place felt wrong, like it was holding its breath. I found little things that unsettled me. His shotgun still leaned against the wall, unloaded. A cold pot of stew on the stove, half-eaten and thick with mold. And his journal. Grandpa wasn't the type to write much, but when I opened the notebook he kept by his chair, I saw pages and pages of frantic scrawls in his shaky handwriting. He'd filled half the book with the same sentence, over and over. "They're coming closer." I couldn't sleep that night, not in the cabin. I rolled out my sleeping bag on the porch instead, figuring I'd pack up and leave first thing in the morning. The night was cold, and the wind made the trees groan like living things. It was just after midnight when I heard the first sound, a low, guttural howl that made my stomach twist. I lay there frozen, straining my ears. Another howl answered, closer this time. Then came the whispers, soft, overlapping voices that seemed to rise and fall with the wind. I squeezed my eyes shut, pretending I couldn't hear them. But then came the scream. It wasn't just one scream. It was layers of screaming, high and sharp, like something inhuman was being torn apart deep in the woods. I felt my chest tighten as panic set in. I wanted to run, but where would I go? There was no way I'd make it to my car without a flashlight, and the thought of stepping into that forest, even for a second, made my skin crawl. The noises went on for what felt like hours, and when they finally stopped, I stayed awake until dawn, clutching Grandpa's old hunting knife and staring into the treeline. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching me from the shadows. The next day, I found fresh tracks leading away from the cabin. Big, heavy prints in the dirt, like something had been pacing back and forth just beyond the porch. Whatever made them wasn't any animal I knew. The prints were deep, clawed, and wrong, like the ground itself had recoiled from them. That was when I realized Grandpa hadn't been imagining things. Something was out there, and he had gone looking for it. I couldn't stop thinking about those tracks. They were unlike anything I'd ever seen, and they seemed to radiate unease, as if just standing near them was enough to stir some primal instinct to flee. I tried to tell myself it could have been a bear, but the shape wasn't right. And no bear I knew of walked circles around a cabin like it was sizing someone up. I left the cabin that morning, but I couldn't leave the questions behind. What had Grandpa seen? What had he heard? Why did he abandon everything just to go into that forest? I didn't tell my dad about the tracks or the sounds. I wasn't ready for the arguments, the dismissals. But a week later, I found myself back at the cabin, this time with better gear, hiking boots, a high-powered flashlight, and Grandpa's shotgun. Part of me knew I was being reckless, but another part felt like I owed it to him. I had to know. The forest felt different in the daylight, almost inviting. Sunlight filtered through the canopy, turning the mossy ground into a patchwork of green and gold. Birds chirped, and the air was crisp, smelling of pine and damp earth. But as I followed the tracks deeper into the woods, that uneasy feeling crept back, gnawing at the edges of my mind. The tracks were strange. They didn't follow a straight line. Instead, they zigzagged, circled back on themselves, and at one point, led straight up to the base of a massive tree. The bark was gouged with deep scratches, as though something with claws had climbed it. Looking up, I half expected to see something staring back at me, but the branches above swayed emptily in the wind. About a mile in, I found something worse. Clearing. The trees here were dead, charred and blackened, as if lightning had struck them, though there hadn't been any storms in months. The ground was littered with bones, most of them too small to be human but still unsettling. They were picked clean, some arranged in strange patterns I didn't understand. At the center of the clearing was a pile of stones, stacked deliberately, like a marker or a grave. I stood there, heart pounding, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. That's when I noticed the silence. The birds were gone. The wind was gone. The forest around me was utterly still, like the world had paused to watch. And then I heard it. A whisper, faint but unmistakable, came from somewhere to my left. "Go back." I froze, gripping the shotgun so tightly my knuckles ached. The voice didn't sound human. It was too layered, as though multiple mouths were speaking in unison. I turned slowly, scanning the trees, but there was nothing there. Another whisper came, this time from behind me. "You shouldn't be here." I wanted to run, but my legs felt rooted to the spot. The whispers grew louder, closer, overlapping until they became a cacophony. Then, cutting through them like a blade, came the scream. It was the same scream I'd heard on the porch. A piercing, gut-wrenching sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The ground beneath me felt like it was trembling, and I realized with a sick jolt that the stacked stones in the clearing were shifting, as though something beneath them was struggling to get free. I didn't wait to find out what it was. I ran, crashing through the underbrush, branches clawing at my arms and face. The whispers followed me, though I didn't dare look back. The forest seemed darker now, the trees closing in, the air heavier with each step. It wasn't until I burst out onto the dirt road near the cabin that the noises stopped. But the silence wasn't comforting. Felt like a warning. I barely remember driving home that day. My hands were shaking so badly I almost went off the road twice. And every time I glanced in the rearview mirror, I expected to see something lurking behind me. By the time I made it back to my apartment, I locked the door, shoved a chair under the handle, and sat there in the dark, staring at the shotgun across my lap. I didn't sleep that night. The worst part wasn't the whispers or the scream. It was the clearing, the bones, that strange pile of stones. Whatever had been under there, it was still there, and I had no idea what I'd disturbed. For the next few days, I tried to go about life as usual. I went to work, nodded through conversations, and ignored the growing knot in my stomach. But at night, I couldn't escape the feeling that something was watching me. I'd hear faint tapping on my windows, though I lived on the 3rd floor. Shadows would move in the corner of my eye, but when I turned, there'd be nothing there. And the dreams started. Every night, I dreamed of the forest. I'd find myself back in that clearing, standing before the pile of stones. In the dream, the forest was silent, suffocatingly so, and the stones were always shifting, something beneath them clawing, writhing, trying to escape. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, the sound of whispers still lingering in my ears. By the end of the week, I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to go back. I needed answers. I told myself it was about Grandpa, that I was doing this for him, but deep down, I think I was looking for some way to end the fear. I packed my gear again, this time with more supplies, a stronger flashlight, and extra shells for the shotgun. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I didn't want anyone talking me out of it. When I arrived at the cabin, the air felt heavier, like the forest itself was holding its breath. I could see the tracks again, though they were fainter now, as if time or weather had tried to erase them. I followed them back into the woods, retracing my steps from before. As I neared the clearing, the uneasy silence returned, swallowing every sound. The crunch of leaves under my boots, the rustle of branches in the breeze. Even my own breathing felt muted. And then I saw it, the stones. They weren't just shifting this time, they were broken, scattered, as if something had erupted from beneath them. The ground where they'd been was a dark, gaping hole, its edges raw and jagged, like the earth had been ripped apart. Around the hole, the bones had been rearranged into strange spirals and symbols, patterns that made my stomach churn just looking at them. I crouched near the edge of the hole, shining my flashlight inside. The beam barely penetrated the darkness, but I could see that the hole didn't end. It just kept going deeper and deeper, like a tunnel bored into the earth. The walls were clawed, raw dirt smeared with what looked like dried blood. And then I heard it again, a whisper. "You shouldn't have come back." It was closer this time, clearer. I whipped around, shotgun raised, but the forest behind me was empty. My flashlight's beam cut through the trees, catching only the twisting branches and shifting shadows. The whisper came again, louder now, angrier. "Go!" And then the scream. It tore through the forest, louder than before, making my ears ring and my chest ache with the sheer force of it. The ground shook beneath my feet, and from the hole, I heard something moving. Something big. I didn't wait to see what it was. I ran, but this time the forest didn't let me go so easily. The trees seemed to close in around me, their branches snagging my clothes, my hair. Shadows darted just beyond the edge of my vision, and the whispers followed me, growing louder, faster, overlapping into a frenzied chorus. "You should have stayed away. You woke it. It's too late now." By the time I stumbled out of the forest and back to the cabin, I could barely breathe. My clothes were torn, my face scratched, and my hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped the shotgun. But I didn't stop moving. I sprinted straight for my car, throwing myself into the driver's seat and locking the doors like a child scared of monsters under the bed. The forest was silent again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. The shadows between the trees felt alive, shifting and pulsing with an unnatural rhythm. I fumbled with the keys, my hands slick with sweat, and the engine roared to life. As I backed down the dirt road, I swore I saw movement, something tall and thin slipping between the trees, keeping pace with the car. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away. Even then, I didn't feel safe. My heart didn't stop hammering until I pulled into my apartment parking lot. But the fear didn't leave me. Not completely. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the building, every gust of wind against the windows, sent me into a spiral of panic. And the dreams, they were worse. This time, I wasn't just standing in the clearing. I was in the hole, the walls pressing in around me, the air thick with rot and decay. I could feel something massive breathing in the darkness, its presence filling the tunnel like a storm cloud. I tried to climb out, but the walls crumbled beneath my hands, dragging me deeper and deeper. When I woke, I could still hear the whispers. I tried to go back to normal after that, but normal didn't exist anymore. The dreams came every night, and the strange occurrences followed me wherever I went. I'd hear faint tapping on my windows, even in broad daylight. My lights would flicker, and I'd find scratches on the walls of my apartment. Long, jagged marks that hadn't been there before. And then there were the footprints. One morning, I woke up to find them outside my door. The same clawed, heavy prints I'd seen near the cabin, leading from the hallway and stopping just in front of my apartment. They didn't go back. Whatever had made them had just stopped. That was when I realized I couldn't run from this. Whatever I'd stirred up in the forest, it had followed me. It wasn't going to leave me alone. Not until I went back. So I did. Driving back to the forest felt like walking into my own grave. I wasn't sure what I'd do once I got there or how I'd survive it, but I knew I didn't have a choice. Whatever this was, it wasn't going to let me go. Not unless I faced it. The cabin was exactly as I'd left it. The front porch sagging under years of neglect. The windows dark and empty. It was almost comforting to see it still standing, but the forest beyond it felt different. The trees seemed closer, their branches arching toward the cabin like skeletal fingers. The air was thicker, heavier, and the silence was suffocating. I didn't stop to gather my nerves. I grabbed the shotgun, slung a flashlight over my shoulder, and marched straight into the woods. Every step felt like a test, the whispers starting faint and distant but growing louder with each stride. They weren't pleading this time. They were mocking, taunting. "Fool, you came back. You won't leave again." The clearing was worse than before. The spirals of bones had grown, stretching out like veins across the forest floor. The hole was larger, its edges crumbling, and the smell rising from it was unbearable. Wet earth mixed with something sweet and rancid, like rotting meat. I could hear movement deep inside, the sound of something vast shifting in the darkness. I stood there, trembling, trying to steady my breathing. "I'm not afraid of you," I whispered, though my voice cracked. The lie tasted bitter. The whispers stopped. For a moment, the forest was completely silent. Then, from the depths of the hole, a voice rose. Not a whisper this time, but a low, guttural growl that vibrated in my chest. It wasn't speaking any language I recognized, but I understood the meaning all the same. "Come closer." I took a step back, but my foot landed on a bone, snapping it in half with a sickening crack. The sound echoed through the clearing, and whatever was in the hole reacted. A hand, if you could call it that, reached out, clawing at the edge of the pit. It was impossibly long and thin, its flesh pale and stretched tight over sharp bones. The fingers were tipped with claws, each one dripping with some dark, viscous liquid that hissed when it hit the ground. I raised the shotgun and fired. The blast roared through the forest, but the thing didn't flinch. Instead, the hand tightened around the edge of the hole, pulling the rest of its body into view. It was tall, impossibly tall, its limbs bending at unnatural angles as it crawled free. Its face, or what passed for a face, was featureless, save for a wide, lipless mouth filled with needle-like teeth. Its skin glistened in the dim light, a sickly gray that seemed to ripple like water. I stumbled back, reloading as fast as I could, but my hands were shaking too much. The thing turned its head toward me, its mouth curling into something that might have been a smile. Then it spoke, its voice like gravel grinding against glass. "You shouldn't have come." I fired again, and this time it screamed. The sound was deafening, a mix of rage and pain that sent me reeling. But it didn't stop. It lunged toward me, its limbs stretching unnaturally as it closed the distance in seconds. I ran. Branches whipped at my face, the underbrush snagging my legs, but I didn't stop. I could hear it behind me, crashing through the trees, its guttural growls shaking the air. The whispers returned, overlapping with its voice, filling my head until I thought I'd go mad. "You woke it. You can't escape. It's too late." The cabin came into view, and I sprinted toward it, slamming the door shut behind me and jamming a chair under the handle. I could hear the thing outside, circling the cabin, its claws raking against the walls. The whispers grew louder, filling every corner of the room. And then, everything went silent. The silence was the worst part, pressed down on me, suffocating and absolute, like the world had gone hollow. I stood in the middle of the cabin, shotgun raised, every muscle in my body tense. My ears strained for the faintest sound, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I didn't dare move. Minutes passed, or maybe it was hours. Couldn't tell. Then came the first creak. It started in the far corner of the cabin, a soft groan of wood that shouldn't have been possible. I'd built that place with Grandpa when I was a teenager. I knew every plank, every joint. Nothing should have moved unless someone or something was inside. Another creak, this time closer. Then another, and another, each one moving toward me with deliberate slowness. The air grew colder, and a foul smell wafted through the cabin, sharp and sickly sweet, like spoiled meat and damp earth. My stomach churned, and I gagged, trying to hold it together. Then I saw it. The shadows in the corner seemed to ripple, folding in on themselves like a living thing. At first, it was subtle, a trick of the dim light. But as I watched, the shadows began to take shape, coalescing into a long, thin figure. Its limbs stretched unnaturally, fingers trailing against the floor as it hunched forward. And that face, smooth, featureless except for the mouth, that gaping, grinning maw filled with jagged teeth. It didn't speak at first. It just stood there, swaying slightly, as if it were studying me. Then, in a voice that echoed with layers of malice, it rasped, "You brought me here." I raised the shotgun, aiming square at its chest, and fired. The blast lit up the room, and for a split second, I thought I saw it flinch. But when the light faded, it was still standing, its grin wider, darker. "You can't stop me," it hissed. "You only fed me." I fired again, this time aiming for its head. The shot tore through it, splintering the wood behind it, but the thing didn't move. Instead, it began to laugh, a low, guttural sound that shook the walls of the cabin. Then it lunged. I barely had time to react. It moved impossibly fast, closing the distance between us in a heartbeat. Its clawed hand slammed into me, sending me crashing into the wall. The shotgun fell from my grip, skidding across the floor. Pain exploded in my ribs, but I scrambled to my feet, reaching for the knife strapped to my belt. The thing loomed over me, its grin stretching wider as it leaned in close. "You woke me?" it growled, its voice reverberating through my skull. "Now you'll join me." With a scream, I drove the knife into its chest. The blade sank deep, and for the first time, the thing recoiled. It let out a piercing shriek, its body convulsing as dark, viscous liquid spilled from the wound. I didn't wait for it to recover. I grabbed the shotgun and bolted for the door, kicking the chair aside and throwing it open. Outside, the forest was alive with movement. Shadows darted between the trees, and the whispers were everywhere, louder than ever. But I didn't look back. I ran for the car, fumbling with the keys as the thing's screams echoed behind me. I managed to get the engine started just as the cabin door slammed open. In the rearview mirror, I saw it standing there, its body twitching, its grin gone. For the first time, it looked angry. I floored it. The road twisted and turned as I sped away, the forest blurring into a dark haze. But even as the cabin disappeared behind me, the whispers didn't fade. They followed me, growing softer but never leaving entirely. When I reached the highway, I pulled over, gasping for air. My hands were trembling so badly I could barely keep the car steady. But as I sat there, staring into the rearview mirror, I realized something that made my blood run cold. The whispers weren't coming from the forest anymore. They were coming from inside the car. I froze, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The whispers were faint at first, just a low hum beneath the roar of the engine. But they were unmistakable, soft, layered voices, overlapping in a twisted, almost melodic cadence. I glanced into the back seat, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might crack my ribs. There was nothing there. Just empty seats and shadows stretching longer than they should have in the dim glow of the dashboard lights. I wanted to believe it was my mind playing tricks on me, but the whispers grew louder. You can't escape. You brought it with you. I slammed the gas pedal, the car lurching forward as I sped down the empty highway. The trees on either side blurred into a dark smear, but no matter how fast I went, the whispers stayed. They weren't outside the car. They were around me, inside me, worming their way into my thoughts. And then the lights flickered. The headlights sputtered once, twice, and then went out completely, plunging me into total darkness. The engine sputtered next, coughing and choking like it was being strangled. The car slowed to a crawl, coasting to a stop in the middle of the empty road. "Come on," I muttered, fumbling with the keys. I turned them again and again, but the engine wouldn't catch. The air in the car grew thick, stifling, and the whispers turned to laughter, low, guttural chuckles that seemed to vibrate in the very air around me. And then I saw it. In the rearview mirror, something moved. At first, it was just a shadow, rippling across the back seat. But as I stared, it began to take form. A long, thin figure, its limbs bending and twisting in unnatural ways as it unfolded itself from the shadows. Its face, pale and featureless save for that awful, jagged grin, seemed to stretch wider as it leaned closer to me. "You woke me?" it rasped, its voice filling the car like a storm. "Now you'll feed me." I threw open the door and ran. The asphalt was cold under my feet, the night air biting against my skin, but I didn't stop. The forest loomed on either side of the highway, and the thought of running into it made my stomach churn. But staying on the road felt just as dangerous. I could hear it behind me. Its heavy, shuffling steps, its ragged breaths, the sound of claws scraping against the pavement. "Run all you want," it called after me, its voice mocking. "You'll never leave." I didn't know how far I ran. My lungs burned. My legs screamed for me to stop, but I couldn't. Every time I looked back, I saw it. Its pale form illuminated by the faint glow of the moon, moving faster than it had any right to. The world around me felt twisted, wrong. The trees seemed to close in, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. And then I saw the lights. A pair of headlights appeared in the distance, cutting through the darkness like a beacon. I stumbled toward them, waving my arms, shouting for help. The car slowed as it approached, and a wave of relief washed over me as the driver's window rolled down. "What the hell's going on?" a man's voice called out. Before I could answer, the thing screamed. It was a horrible, ear-splitting sound that seemed to shake the very air around us. The driver's face went pale, his eyes widening as he looked past me. "What is that?" he whispered. "Drive," I shouted, running to the passenger side. "Just drive." He didn't need to be told twice. I barely got the door shut before the car lurched forward, the tires squealing as we sped down the road. I looked out the back window and saw it standing in the middle of the highway, its grin wider than ever. It didn't chase us. It didn't need to. As we drove, I could still hear the whispers, faint and lingering in the back of my mind. "You can't escape. It's part of you now." The man driving the car, whose name I learned was Frank, didn't ask many questions at first. He just kept glancing at me out of the corner of his eye, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. I must have looked half dead, scratched up, wide-eyed, covered in dirt. My breath was ragged, and my hands wouldn't stop shaking. "What the hell was that thing?" he finally asked, his voice trembling. "I don't know," I said, barely able to get the words out. "But it's been following me. Ever since." I stopped myself. How could I explain? That I'd gone looking for my grandfather and stirred up something I didn't understand? That I'd dragged it out of the forest and into my life? Frank didn't press me. Maybe he could sense that I was holding something back, or maybe he didn't want to know. Either way, he kept his foot on the gas, the car speeding through the night. The highway was empty, just an endless stretch of dark road flanked by looming trees. But even with the car moving, the air felt heavy. Wrong. I could still feel it, somewhere out there in the darkness, watching. waiting, and then the car slowed. "What are you doing?" I snapped, panic creeping into my voice. "I'm not doing anything," Frank said, his voice tight with fear. He slammed his foot on the gas, but the car didn't respond. The engine sputtered, and the lights began to flicker, just like before. "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "Not again." The car coasted to a stop, the engine dying with a pitiful cough. Frank fumbled with the keys, trying to restart it, but it was no use. The lights went out completely, plunging us into darkness. "Stay in the car," Frank said, his voice shaking. "I'll check under the hood." "No!" I grabbed his arm. "You can't go out there." But he shook me off and got out anyway, slamming the door behind him. I leaned over the center console, peering out the windshield as he popped the hood and shone his flashlight inside. The beam of light flickered, the bulb struggling to stay alive, and my stomach twisted. "Frank, get back in the car," I shouted, my voice cracking. He didn't answer. He just stood there, staring into the engine, his body unnaturally still. The flashlight slipped from his hand, clattering to the ground and plunging the road into near-total darkness. My pulse pounded in my ears as I reached for the door handle, ready to pull him back in. And then I saw it. At first, it was just a shadow moving too fast for me to make sense of it. But then it stepped into the faint glow of the moonlight, towering over Frank. Its limbs stretched impossibly long, its head tilting at an unnatural angle. That grin, wide, jagged, hungry, gleamed in the dark. Frank didn't even scream. One of its arms shot out, claws slicing through him like paper. His body crumpled to the ground, lifeless, before I could even react. I slammed my hand over my mouth, holding back a sob as the thing turned its head toward the car. It moved slowly, deliberately, its limbs cracking and popping with each step. "You can't run," it rasped, its voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "You can't hide." My hands fumbled for the door handle, but I couldn't make myself move. It was like the air had turned to sludge, every muscle in my body locked in place as it closed the distance. The thing stopped just outside the driver's side window, its face inches from the glass. I could see every detail, the pale, stretched skin, the gaping mouth filled with teeth that didn't seem to end. It raised one clawed hand, dragging it down the window with a slow, deliberate screech that set my teeth on edge. "You brought me here," it hissed, "and now you'll feed me." And then it disappeared. One moment it was there, and the next it was gone, swallowed by the darkness. I sat frozen, my breath coming in shallow gasps, the weight of its presence still hanging in the air. The whispers returned, soft and mocking, as if the forest itself was laughing at me. I sat there in the silent car, paralyzed, my pulse hammering so loudly it drowned out the faint, mocking whispers. My mind raced through every possible action. Run, hide, scream, but none of it felt like it would make a difference. The thing was toying with me, and deep down, I knew it wasn't finished. Frank's body lay crumpled on the road, a lifeless shadow in the moonlight. I forced myself to look away, biting back the rising bile in my throat. I needed to move. Staying in the car wasn't safe anymore. With trembling hands, I grabbed the shotgun from the passenger seat and eased the door open as quietly as I could. The forest loomed on either side of the highway, dark and impenetrable. I didn't want to go in there, but I couldn't stay out in the open either. Every instinct screamed at me to keep moving. I crept toward the tree line, my flashlight barely cutting through the oppressive darkness. The whispers followed, weaving in and out of the trees, taunting me. "You'll never escape. It's already inside you. This is where you belong." The air grew colder as I ventured deeper, my breaths coming in shallow puffs of mist. The ground was soft and uneven, littered with roots that seemed to grab at my ankles. Every step felt heavier, like the forest itself was pulling me down, trying to swallow me whole. And then I saw the clearing. It wasn't supposed to be here. I'd run miles from the cabin, from the place where it all started, but somehow I was back. The spirals of bones were gone now, replaced by jagged symbols carved into the ground. each one glowing faintly with an unnatural light. The hole in the center was wider, deeper, and from its depths came a sound. A low, rhythmic thrum, like a heartbeat. I stopped at the edge, unable to tear my eyes away. The light from the symbols pulsed in time with the sound, casting eerie shadows that twisted and danced. The air here was thick, almost liquid, and every breath felt like it was dragging me closer to the edge. And then it emerged. The thing climbed out of the hole with an agonizing slowness, its limbs bending at impossible angles. It was bigger now, its body stretching and distorting as if it were feeding off the very air around it. That grin was still there, impossibly wide, and its eyeless face turned toward me as it spoke. "You were always meant to come back." I raised the shotgun, my hands trembling, and fired. The blast hit it square in the chest. But the thing didn't flinch. It just laughed. A deep, resonant sound that made the ground tremble beneath my feet. "You think you can stop me?" It growled. "You think this ends with you?" It lunged, faster than I could react, and the next thing I knew, I was on the ground, the shotgun skittering away into the dark. Its claws pinned me down, their sharp edges digging into my shoulders as its face hovered inches from mine. Its breath was rancid, hot and foul, and its grin stretched so wide I thought its head might split in two. "You woke me?" it whispered, its voice like 1,000 voices speaking in unison. "You opened the door. Now you'll never close it." Summoning every ounce of strength I had left, I reached into my jacket and grabbed the knife. With a scream, I drove it into the thing's neck, twisting as hard as I could. It let out a roar of rage, its grip loosening just enough for me to roll free. I didn't stop to think. I grabbed the shotgun, aimed it at the glowing symbols on the ground, and fired. The blast tore through the earth, disrupting the pattern, and the glowing light began to flicker and fade. The thing howled, its body writhing and twisting as the symbols died. The ground beneath it began to crack, the hole widening into a chasm that seemed to reach into infinity. It clawed at the edges, its grin finally replaced with something else. Fear. "You can't stop this," it snarled as it slipped into the darkness. "You can't undo what you've done." And then it was gone. The forest fell silent. The air lightened, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I could breathe again. I staggered to my feet, the adrenaline wearing off and leaving me weak. The clearing was just a patch of dirt now, the hole gone, as if it had never been there. I didn't wait to see if it would come back. I ran. It's been months since that night, and I haven't gone back to the forest. I don't plan to, but the thing's words still haunt me. I don't know if I stopped it or just delayed the inevitable. Sometimes, late at night, I hear whispers, soft, faint, almost easy to ignore, almost